This works okay. And yeah, I miss being there with you all. So we'll do the best we can here. And let me start by bringing up some slides. All right. So, I have forever, and by forever, I mean like since the mid 1980s, been trying to figure out how to be a good ally. In fact, I've been trying to figure out how to be a good ally before we even use that word, long before we even use that word. And I keep striving toward it. And what I'll talk about today is kind of the way I have been thinking in the past several years, and actually, in some ways, particularly in the last year, because I've been heavily influenced actually by what has been going on in response to the pandemic called mutual aid. And as I have looked at the practice and learned from the practice of mutual aid around the country, I have become kind of more and more influenced by various kinds of pacifist, anarchist philosophies and approaches. And so you'll see that coming out here in what I talk about today. So I want to start by looking at this question of margin to center. You know, those of you who read bell hooks long ago, remember her coining the term from margin to center. And, it has had a good cause. But since then, I've seen so many of us in academia wanting to move whatever we think our own marginalized perspective is to the quote unquote center. And I've actually started to worry about that. And so let's look at these terms for a minute. So margin being border or edge. So a margin delineates kind of the inside from the outside. And that first graphic over there, those of you who make margin notes in your documents, the document itself, it's okay. It's the thing you get published, but the really interesting stuff is in the margins because that's where all the creativity happens in your margin notes. Now, if we think about marginalized, it's one thing to be in the margins. It's another thing to be forced into the margins, to have your perspective, to have your experience, to have your identity, to have your race, to have your person forcibly placed outside of a border. And then think about the word center. So center is spatially in the middle. Politically, it is the moderate perspective. And, what does it mean to be in the middle? And then what does it mean to be on the margins around that center? What are the costs of being on the margin? And there are costs. There are costs in terms of access to all kinds of important things that are both for quality of life and indeed for life itself. But what are the costs of being in the center? What are the constraints of being in the center? What are the self-interests that develop from being in the center? And to what extent do our self-interests when we are in the center make us complicit in maintaining the margins? So let's for a minute look at the centering of higher education community engagement. So how have we centered higher education community engagement? Well, we've centered it by placing students before community. Historically, in the US, our concept of service learning emphasized student learning, not community impact. And if you continue to look today at how we document it, we document student learning, we publish student learning. Only rarely do we publish community impact? It's also focused on curriculum needs, not community needs. We have our course, and then we go look for a project that fits our course. We don't find a project and then try to fit our course to it, except again in rare circumstances. Centering also means safety first. We are more likely to engage with privileged service organizations over change organizations, even to the extent of thinking about community engagement as engagement with government organizations, public education organizations. And interestingly, I suspect we avoid risky projects. And one of the ways we avoid them is by emphasizing long-term relationships. So in long-term relationships, we can build a safe relationship. We can build a safe project. And this is particularly the way that we funnel students into volunteer activities. We grab a few privileged organizations in the community, and those are the ones that we funnel volunteers to semester after semester after semester. And as people become concerned with this, we've transitioned to what we call reciprocity and mutual benefit. And those words actually trouble me, because what reciprocity seems to mean is that we engage students in doing something for a community group. And in exchange, that community group provides our students with learning. That's an alienated exchange relationship because it involves getting two separate things from the relationship. And so it's an exchange. It's not a mutual relationship, but one where one thing is exchanged for the other. And those two things aren't alike and they don't have a common purpose. And then there seems to be this underlying assumption that we can get equitable results from inequitable power relationships. So this idea of mutual benefit, if I represent a multi-billion-dollar higher education institution, and I am working with an organization that has one part-time staff member, or in some cases, no staff at all, what does mutual benefit mean? Should we actually really be getting the same benefit over such an inequitable relationship? So what are the consequences of centering? Well, one of them is this idea I have such a difficult time wrapping my head around. So forced volunteerism. And those of you old enough to remember George Carlin, jumbo shrimp. It's an oxymoron that is just, I don't know what to do with it. We require students to volunteer. And how does one require someone to volunteer? How is that even possible? But we do it by setting credit requirements. We do it by setting hours requirements. And so the volunteerism is not voluntary. So as a consequence, what happens is the volunteering has an externalized purpose and motivation. Too many students end up doing this because they have to, or because they can get course credit. rather than because they believe in the mission and they believe in the purpose of the group that they are volunteering for or working with. And then this creates institutionalized and captive relationships. So, again, this standard of long-term service learning, that you have to pick your organization and stick with it. Well, what happens in the community is when you pick your organization and stick with it, and everybody else who's doing this picks their organization and sticks with it, you have some organizations who are haves, they get access to the institutional resources, and other organizations that are have nots who don't get access to the institutional resources. And then you get a kind of community dependency. This is the thing that we worry about with quote unquote welfare, is that we have structured welfare to make people dependent. And to what extent are we making community groups dependent on an institution by stopping their other kinds of volunteer recruitment activities because it's easy to get volunteers from the university? And then there's mainstreaming and declawing. And declawing comes from my colleague, Corey Dolgan, who has similar concerns about the way we are doing higher education civic engagement. So we have created a set of bureaucratized definitions and standards. So we have said, if you do this, it's service learning. If you do these other things, it's not. And then we do output evaluations. Those of you who work in evaluation land know that we distinguish between outputs and outcomes and sometimes impacts. Outputs are the things that we do. Outcomes and impacts are the things that happen because of what we do. But what we typically document is the hours that students put in, the learning that students get. And then when we do evaluation with community groups, we typically ask them, how happy were you with our service learning? What we don't ask them about is what changed because of it. What's now different? What's now better because of it? And so I worry then, especially as we create campus centers for this work, whether centers are the solution. And here are some of the potential indicators when they are not the solution. One is when they are not marginalized, even if their budgets are marginalized, because in higher education now, too many budgets of too many offices are marginalized. When they're controlled by private funders, they're not marginalized. They are part of the private funder. And lots of service learning centers around the country are actually funded by private funders, and they are consequently influenced on an ongoing basis by those private funders. They're controlled by institution policy. They have to have all of their protections, all of their legal waivers, all of their bureaucratic standards in place. And then there are pressures for non-controversial visibility. So the pressure is on to find the safe volunteer activities rather than the edgy work with controversial groups out there. Lots of centers have a service and not a change orientation. So they emphasize their volunteer programs. We provide volunteers to community organizations. That's a service. They emphasize the development of student leadership. We are building student leaders for the future. And in too many cases, like in my institution, That means we are building leaders from students who already have privilege, more than we are building leaders from students who lack such privilege. And then we neglect or ignore community development and direct capacity building. How many institutional centers actually have skilled staff who can work with organizations to do strategic planning, who can work with organizations to troubleshoot their organizational structures and organizational cultures, who can help them develop goals, who can help them pursue those goals. How many centers have staff with that kind of expertise who are out actually working with organizations? And then finally, when they are complicit in institutional surveillance culture. I don't know what your institution is like, but the institutional surveillance culture that is building at many universities, I have to report on what I did, like, to 4 different places now, and on a regular basis. And that surveillance culture also focuses on reporting numbers, not results. So, my institution doesn't care about those cool things that happened from my work that Andy was talking about. My institution cares about, how many students are enrolled in my courses, how many grant dollars I brought in, and those kinds of things. And what's most interesting is as the centers create these kind of bureaucratized rules, what surveillance culture tells us is to emphasize the minimums, not the maximums. So surveillance culture is, did you do the minimum of these numbers of things? The contrast is, what is the absolute best, coolest thing we can do? And how, as an institution, can we support you to do the best, coolest things? That's not how surveillance culture works. And so from centers to margins, let's get out of the centers. Let's go back to the margins. I personally actually really like working in the margins, as even with all of my privilege, when I can find ways to be under the radar, as some people talk about it, or on the margins. It's where I like to be. And Sarah Evans and Harry Boyd, way back in the 1980s, talked about these things called free spaces. And they defined those as settings between private lives and larger scale institutions where ordinary citizens can act with dignity, independence, and vision. It is those spaces outside of the bureaucratic constraints, outside of the boxes. The New York Times, in reviewing their book, simply referred to this as where we learn democracy. When we are in free spaces, this is the situation many mutual aid groups found themselves in during the pandemic. When you're in a free space, you have to figure it out. You have to figure out how to make decisions. You have to figure out what your culture is. You have to figure out how to be inclusive. You have to figure out how to move on an issue. You can't just follow the rules as they are set down, because the rules are designed to keep things the same, not to make them better. So where might the free spaces be? So one of the places that they might be is in institutions with strong academic freedom policies. Now, we are seeing academic freedom being whittled away at all across the country as policies, particularly in public institutions where policies come from legislators, that are restricting more and more speech on campus. And how many institutions how have non-threatening conflict of interest and outside activity policies? How many really promote faculty academic freedom and are vocal about that support? So another place are departments or centers that have solidarity on the margins. And sometimes you will find these in race, ethnicity, gender, disability, and other similar departments and centers. Places where people on the margins gather and feel either safe or brave, depending on the situation. There are also some departments with extra capacity for faculty to work on the margins. When I pitch my idea that you should design your course around the community rather than design your community around the course, what I often hear is, look, our faculty are working full out, just teaching the required courses. There's no way we can do anything extra. But some places can, some departments can. My department, for example, allows me to teach one of our capstone courses. Capstones are amazing courses because they are designed to engage students in pulling together the stuff that they've learned in the major, but they don't have to have any content. And so in a capstone course, the community's project can be the content because in sociology, it's actually pretty easy for students to pull together the stuff that they've been learning with almost any community project. And then, of course, there are independent studies. I have numerous students who do community designed projects through independent study work. And so then there's us individual faculty who can work on the margins. Sometimes that means working extra, but sometimes we can creatively combine things that we're doing. And we'll talk about that actually at the session later this afternoon. And then there are organizations of students on the margins. In some cases, those students may be community members. Community colleges are actually a very interesting place because if one of the problems of doing service learning at a community college is that you could send some students out who see their classmates at the service organization because those classmates are actually getting services from those service organizations. And so if we remember in community colleges that the students are likely to be the community members who are targeted by the service learning, it allows for an entirely different way of thinking about student engagement. These organizations also often have students already have justice and change orientation. And then where we can be more certain that we'll find free spaces. So community groups are resistant to the nonprofit industrial complex. If you've never heard the phrase nonprofit industrial complex, get a hold of the book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. It's one of the most important books that talks about how the nonprofit system is actually designed to keep things the same rather than make things better. Informal grassroots collectives, we don't always have to work with nonprofits. We can work with informal groups of folks who are just trying to pull stuff together and could use some extra capacity. And then, of course, there are unorganized constituencies, people who all have an issue, but they haven't yet connected with each other. And of course, this is where, if you have access to a community organizer, it gets really fun. So then, how do we get from the margin to the streets? So first of all, think about engaging in two types of change. First, you find a group that's working on a specific issue. So there's something in particular that they want to make better. And you work with them, providing what you can so that they can use that to make that thing better. And then there are the overall power relationships. So not just about the issue, but in general, what's the relationship between me as an academic and the community group in regards to who has knowledge and who has knowledge power, and how do we balance that? The next step is then organizing around that issue with that community. That sometimes means organizing the partners, and that means finding a common goal. Not the, okay, I can get some learning and you can get some stuff from me, but now what's the goal that we have together that's the same? And then we think about our service as activism. So this is about building the power of the group, and this is about engaging in strategic action with the group. And then the learning is no longer for the students. The learning is for everybody involved, the professor included, and in some cases, especially the professor. And it's focused on furthering the activism. It's not focused on learning the course content. So here's the juxtaposition from learning at the top and change at the bottom, which is the institutionalized service learning model, to change at the top and then learning at the bottom. And when I make that switch, things just become a lot more fun. So in the last couple of minutes, I want to tell you about one of my most fun projects that actually, it's one of these things where, yeah, we did kind of have a long-term relationship, but so we had a 4-year relationship in this project. And my relationship continues, but my active involvement doesn't, because we did all the things that they wanted us to do. And now they are on their own doing stuff. So here's a quick story. So the Urban Community Arts Network, UCAN, is an organization in medicine dedicated to ending discrimination against hip hop. Hippy Dippy Madison is like, it's nirvana for us white folks. It is not if you are a person of color. We put more Black men in jail per capita than practically any place in the country, though admittedly there's a lot of competition for that title. Um, and so we have bars that have explicit dress codes against hip hop culture. They have censored the jukeboxes to take out controversial hip hop. And hip hop artists have a very difficult time getting stage time in Madison. And so this group organized. So these are both allies and artists involved in UCAN. And I, long story how I came across them, but in any event, their president approached me and knew what I did and said, we could really use what you do. And I said, okay, look at me. I you will find probably no one less suited to work with hip hop than me. I mean, I'm an old rocker, and I knew hip hop mostly through my daughter. And they said, "That's all right. We know hip hop. You don't need to know hip hop. We'll teach you hip hop. And what we need is good research." I was like, sounds like fun. And oh my goodness, if they taught me hip hop, it has been so cool to be a learner. And where I knew absolutely I was not the smartest person in the room. Uh, and I knew what my contribution could be. And so, they had a very clear change goal. And they were building a community of artists, allies, and now bringing uh, researchers and students into that. And so we built this community focused on ending discrimination against hip hop. So, I mean, this was the goal that I shared, that the students shared, that UCAN shared. We did not have separate goals here. We had one goal. And our service was research that targeted the sources of discrimination. One was a study of police data. The second year was a study of news coverage. The third year was a study of artist experiences. The fourth was a study of alternative venues, anti-bias training, and festival inclusion for hip hop. In very much in brief, there was no evidence that live hip hop attracted more violence from the police study. We saw news bias against artists of color from the news study. We found artists experienced discrimination in numerous ways, and we had a whole collection of stories. And then we found these models for alternative venues, anti-bias training, and festival inclusion. During this time, UCAN was able to convince the city of Madison to establish an entertainment equity task force that UCAN was in charge of, that produced an official report that UCAN was starting to get the city to act on right when the damn pandemic hit. But now they're reigniting that effort, and they have attracted an international organization that focuses on building music cities, quote unquote, and creating equity in entertainment. And so UCAN has used this research all along the way to build their power and to start the process of policy change in the city. And for me, that is the gold standard of work for this. So I'll stop there and then some questions. These are my questions, but I welcome you to focus on your questions instead.
Randy, thank you so much for that. And what I would like to suggest, since we don't have a ton of people, and I know you like a little bit of personal interaction, if people, to ask your question or to make a comment, if you could raise your virtual hand, and then Randy, are you comfortable just calling on people?
Absolutely, and feel welcome to use the chat as well.
Yeah, okay. I didn't know if you wanted to do both. So there's my virtual hand. If you don't know where that is, it's on the bottom row under reactions. And then you click on reactions, you'll see a option that says raise your hand. And now I shall lower my hand. Could you, what were the two, I lost your two questions, the questions for us. Could you repeat those?
What are your free spaces that you could do this work through? And what are your institutional boxes that might make it hard? Jonathan.
Hello, thank you very much for this incredible talk. Thinking about UVA and how efforts to engage with the community in Charlottesville have gone, there is a long history that we have to keep in mind when we reach out to communities that there have been UVA research has contributed to the destruction of neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods in Charlottesville. There's been deeply unethical medical research that's happened over the last century, and things like that. So as somebody who's trying to do work in the community, I've become more and more sensitive to to how insulting it can be to like show up at some meeting and go like, hey, I'm from UVA, as if that's a good thing. I'm going to solve your problems. Do Do you have a similar kind of town and gown disconnect at Wisconsin? And how do you work with that?
It is not quite so intense here, um, partly because Madison is kind of set up as a European city. We have pushed all our poverty to the outskirts of the city. And so the university's relationship has been more one of neglect than actively messing things up. But you know that has created the same kind of distrust in some ways. It's like, yeah, what you doing here? What's in this for you? And and I get asked that frequently. Uh, Even when I'm brought in by a leader of a group, the members will present some justifiable skepticism. And that one of the things that seems to help is, at the first meeting, what I try to do is facilitate a conversation that I mostly just listen to. So, it's a conversation about, okay, what's the stuff that you're working on? Where do you see your capacity gaps? What kinds of things do you want to know about? Um, how do you think people like us could contribute to any of that? And the more that I listen, um, it helps. But I mean, I already have an advantage coming in because somebody has sponsored me into the group. A group leader has sponsored me into the group. And for folks who are not in that situation, one of the things that I encourage people to do is to not show up at a group as a member of your institution. Show up at the group as you, and be willing to be part of the group. I mean, one of the things that I've done, even if I already have legitimacy, I show up early for the meetings and I set up chairs and set up tables, and if it's a meal event, wash dishes afterwards, and um, you know, and I get invited to other things that the group does, and I show up for those things, rather than thinking, oh, I'm only doing my projects. I'm not going to that other stuff. No, I show up for that. And the more those kinds of things I do, and the less, the more that I make it clear that there's like a lot of stuff I don't know. And that's what was so cool about working with UCAN, is the power in the room felt so much more equitable because they knew I was just a dumb white guy, and they also saw me learning along the way, um, and that was just really fun. Yeah, Dave.
I was taking notes. I thought I knew everything you thought, but this talk gave me gave me more to chew on. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is I've been really intrigued by some of the anarchist literature too, and trying to draw on that. But I'm also reading some of the indigenous literature as well, and the commitment to place and the commitment to ideas of, I don't know if it's restorative justice or reparations or something, make me think that I need a longer term engagement to kind of manage some of that, or to be supportive of whatever initiatives the community is taking on. I wonder if you see, because I understand your critiques about kind of the long term, perhaps cultivating an easy and convenient kind of relationship and kind of declawing the organization you're working with. But I also wonder if there's a you know, a counterpoint to that, you know, to really understand a place and the people in it and how, you know, what projects they're trying to get done, you need to be there for a while. And if, yeah, let me stop there. Just, I'm struggling with that notion of long term, I guess. That's my question.
Yeah, thanks actually, because I totally agree with you that so if I start with change and then community and then service and then learning, so that the community part's second, and you know, and that part takes different amounts of time with different groups of people in different places, and my sense is the more distrust there is, the longer it takes. Interestingly enough, I spent a bunch of years working with community college partnerships in Appalachia. Uh, and interestingly enough, I started doing it being funded by a foundation that was funding those partnerships. And so, you know, they'd fly me in and I'd show up and it's like, okay, you know, it's like I already have a strike against me because I'm seen as a foundation representative, even though I was just there to document the process. It took a year of just sitting and listening and asking questions before people began to trust me. And that includes the academics, you know, let alone the community members in the room. And so, yeah, it took a year. But I mean, even at that pace, you know, so the long-term partnership in higher ed service learning lingo means like years and years. And so the question then becomes, well, what's the long term? What do you need to do to have enough of a working relationship to do good work together? And then, you know, like with UCAN, we did a project a year. And at the end of each project, we said, is there something else we can do together? And at the end of each one, they said, yeah, here's the next one. And then finally we got done with the fourth one. They said, yeah, we're good. You know, during these lulls on, go ahead, Dave.
Well, the other one I was going to ask is what do you think of bringing community folks on grounds, and have you done that at all with good effect, both as a capacity building for them and a different mode of learning for those of us nestled in the university?
Yeah, I've had really cool experiences with having organizational leadership in class. And I mean, that was the other thing about UCAN that was so inspiring, is they were willing to come into class. And they did come on campus, partly because they're such a small organization, they don't actually have their own meeting space. And so they came on campus gladly because that was the meeting space. Um, and the and Karen, the president, she probably attended half to 2/3 of the class sessions because our class sessions were planning sessions. So we needed UCAN leadership there anyway. Um, in other cases, you know, we would with other organizations, we go off campus to their space for their meetings, partly because it was just, I mean, it's just really hard to park around UW-Madison.
Randy, so we probably have time for about one or two more questions, but I wanted, before people, just want to make sure that people know Randy is going to be joining us again today at 3, and I've just put a link into the link to his other presentation. It's going to be a more intimate setting where he's going to actually work with us and really thinking through how we might start to implement some of this work in our community engaged classes. And so I want to make sure that anyone who's interested and can do that and hasn't registered to go ahead and do that. And and one question I have, kind of anticipating that meeting, is, you mentioned something very interesting, how that even this seemingly positive notion of reciprocity or mutual benefit, it sounds good on the surface, but it often ends up with two very different sets of goals. We do something for you, the community partner, we provide you a service, and you provide something for our students. You said instead, let's reframe that as, what are our common goals? But I think many faculty are going to be challenged by that notion, even to understand what a common goal might look like when we're so used to thinking about teaching and student and objectives of teaching as one category of thought, and then community goals as another. How do you help even faculty understand what a common goal might look like with a community partner in their classes?
Yeah, thanks. And I think there are a couple pieces of this, and one is, so again, when I start with change rather than learning, so the change thing, what is the community group's change goal? And can I identify with that goal? And I mean, that's another reason that the hip hop thing was so interesting to me, because I mean, I will admit my ignorance of discrimination against hip hop in Madison. I just, it wasn't part of my life. But when I started to hear about it, it's like, okay, this is not just like an entertainment equity issue. This is also a racial issue, and I can easily identify with it as a racial justice issue. And I can even identify it as a kind of cultural diversity and entertainment diversity issue. I don't like, I'm not, I don't like opera, and yet at the same time, if it was experiencing active discrimination, that would bother me. And so I could identify with it. And I think that's important, is can the professor identify with the group's issue? The second thing is to not have the course be required for students, because you don't want students who are there because they have to take the course. The course needs to be one that they can opt into freely because they identify with the issue. And so what happens for my capstone course, we actually have 2 capstone courses. And students can opt into one or the other. And we do everything possible to let our students know the differences in those 2 courses.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I'm still noodling over your questions to us. Where are our free spaces? And how does all this, how does this center versus margins work at UVA? And I'm sure everyone on this Zoom call has lots of thoughts about that, as we've been thinking hard about that as an institution as well. So out of respect for your time, Randy, and so that you can get ready for your next event at 3, I want to wrap this up and first of all say thank you. As I promised, you have an incredibly challenging and provocative perspective that we don't hear very often, and I'm really, really grateful that you were able to share that with us. And for anyone on this call that can come to the 3 o'clock event, I highly recommend it. I think there's still some spaces available. So let's give a virtual, however you do that, hand clap, appreciation, gratitude to Randy Stoecker. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. I appreciate you spending your lunch hour with me. All right.
All right. See you guys soon.